Eastern wisdom and modern life with Alan W. Watts. Produced by KQED San Francisco for the Educational Television and Radio Center. Alan Watts is a scholar, lecturer, and the author of many widely read books on comparative philosophy and religion.
It was as a result of looking at paintings like this that I first became interested in Eastern philosophy. That was many years ago when I was a boy, only about 14 years old. And the thing that grasped me and excited me about this vision of the world was the astonishing sympathy and feeling for the world of nature. Think, for example, of a painting like this, which is called Mountain After Rain. A painting by the Chinese artist Gao Kogung, showing the mist and clouds drifting away after a wet night of pouring rain. And it's fascinating for us to think that pictures of this kind are not what we would call just landscape paintings. They are also icons. That is to say, they are a religious and philosophical kind of painting. We are used, of course, in thinking of iconographic or religious paintings, of thinking of pictures of human figures, of angels and saints and divine beings. But when the mind of the Chinese expresses its religious feeling, it expresses it in the objects of nature. And their feeling for nature is in one very important respect strangely different from ours. And that is as a result of the sensation that the human being is not someone who stands apart from nature and looks at it from an entirely outside position. But the human being has himself the feeling of belonging right in nature. And this is very startlingly illustrated. If you look at another painting, this one by the great Sung Dynasty painter Ma Yuan, called Poet Drinking by Moonlight. You would think it was just a landscape painting and puzzle, find the poet. But if you look very closely in the bottom part of the painting, you will see him right there, drinking a cup of wine, sitting at a table with his boy attendant beside him. I suppose that's the equivalent of what would be a graduate student for a professor of English literature in these days. But that tiny man lost in the landscape is representative and symbolic of the whole attitude of the Chinese mind and of Chinese philosophy to the harmony of man and nature. Man not dominating nature, but fitting into it and feeling perfectly at home. But you know, our attitude is very strangely different. And we constantly use a phrase which in the ears of Chinese people sounds very peculiar indeed. We speak constantly of the conquest of nature, the conquest of space, the conquest of mountains like Everest. And they would say to us, well, what's the matter with you? Why must you be in such a fight all the time with your environment? Aren't you grateful to the mountain that it itself lifted you up when you got to the top of it? Aren't you grateful to space that it opens itself out for you so that you can travel through it? Why do you think all the time of getting into a fight with it? But that is indeed, isn't it, our dominant feeling. That we are using science and technology, the powers of electricity and steel, to carry on a fight with our external world and to beat our surroundings into submission with bulldozers. And it's also the same with our attitude to our own nature, because we've been brought up in a religio-philosophical tradition which has taught us to a great extent to mistrust ourselves. That is to say, it has taught us as reasoning and willing beings to mistrust our animal and instinctual nature. We have inherited a doctrine of original sin, which tells us not to be too friendly, to be very cautious with our own human nature. And this is something which is all very well, for we have indeed achieved marvelous things by technological interference with and alteration of nature. But if this thing is carried beyond a certain point, it gets us into very serious trouble indeed, as a result of what I would call the law of diminishing returns. Now, it's something like this, to illustrate it in a very simple way. Supposing you start mistrusting your own senses. Supposing you're the sort of person who, when you go out for a walk in the morning, you were going down to the market and you wonder, did I turn off the gas stove? And you've only gone a few paces from your house and you think you must go back and take a look in the kitchen and see if you really did turn it off. So back you go and you open the back door and look in the kitchen. Yes, you did turn it off. So you close the back door and off you go again. And then a few paces out you think, I wonder if I really saw correctly. Did I look carefully enough? And if at that point you break down and go back again, the more careful you're going to be, you're never going to get out shopping. You're going to be tied in a bind. And although you may say, well, that's only the sort of thing a very stupid person indeed would do, as a matter of fact, this is what our culture is beginning to carry on in very big dimensions. For example, we are privileged in the United States to enjoy freedom in a way that many other peoples in the world don't have it. Yet at the same time, we're very anxious to be sure that our freedom won't be abused. And we keep saying when somebody does something that is an abuse of freedom, there ought to be a law against it. And so hundreds and thousands of laws are put into effect to prevent people from abusing their freedom. And so much legislation involves the most complicated processes of record keeping. As, for example, the records you have to send in every April to be sure you didn't cheat on your financial affairs. Records which become more and more and more complicated, so that nowadays sending in an ordinary individual income tax return is said to be as complicated as extracting the cube root of a complicated number. And the net result of our anxiety to write down just exactly and to the last hair, so that some shyster lawyer won't find a loophole, exactly and to the last hair what we may and may not do, the net result of this is it's becoming increasingly difficult to do anything at all. In other words, if you want to start a business enterprise, if you want to create, say, a non-profit society, you have to hire lawyers, you have to have whole staffs of secretaries to attend to the bookkeeping, the records, the returns that must be made to the government. And some of our great universities even have vice presidents in charge of relations with the government. The same thing comes out, for example, also in our animosity to nature in the sense of wanting to obliterate distance. We want to go faster and faster everywhere we go, and so annihilate the span of the earth between ourselves and the place we want to reach. But what is the ultimate result of this? Just think of it. If you're getting faster and faster from point to point, and obliterating the distance between points, two things happen. In the first place, all points that are set next to each other by, say, jet propulsion, tend to become the same point. In other words, the faster you can get from Los Angeles to Hawaii, the more Hawaii becomes exactly like Los Angeles. And therefore tourists keep asking, well, has it been spoiled yet? And by that they mean, is it just exactly like home? And furthermore, if we begin to think about our goals in life as destinations, as points to which we must get, it begins to cut out all that makes the point worth having. It's like saying, well, instead of giving you a full banana to eat, I will give you the two precise ends of the banana. and that would not be in any sense a satisfactory meal. But that is what happens as we tend to fight our environment and to want to get rid of the wonderful limitation of space and distance. And you know, if we carry this kind of thing to its ultimate extreme, we get into a most extraordinary tangle, which I think I could very well illustrate in this way. Let's go and have a look over here at a sentence which has been written on the board. That is a sentence which is behaving like we are behaving in our mistrust of nature. That is a sentence which fundamentally does not trust itself. And it says of itself, this statement is false. Now, what do you see funny about that? This sentence behaves in an extremely peculiar way. Because if it is true, then it is not true. And if it's not true, then that's what it says, that it isn't true, so it's true. So that if this statement is true, it is false, and if it is false, it is true, and so on and so on. In other words, the meaning of the sentence is oscillating. It's shaking from true to false, like an electric bell vibrating. And in other words, you might say that this particular sentence is suffering from anxiety. For anxiety is the condition that comes upon us when we fundamentally mistrust ourselves, when we mistrust our own nature, and are trying to keep such a tight grip on it that we start to tremble, as one's hand starts to tremble if you become extremely anxious to hold it still. Now, Chinese thinking, of which there are really two main currents, the Taoist current and the Confucian. Taoist, that's spelled T-A-O-I-S-T, and Confucian. And both of these main currents of Chinese thought agree on one fundamental principle, and that is that the natural world in which we live and human nature itself must basically be trusted. They would say of a person who can't trust his own nature, well, if you can't trust your own nature, how can you trust your very mistrusting of it? How do you know that that's not wrong too? And so if you don't trust your own nature, you are as fundamentally balled up as anyone can get. Now it's interesting to look at the fundamental Chinese word, which we translate as nature, because it has a rather different meaning from the word that we use. In Chinese, nature is written like this. You know that Chinese characters are fundamentally pictures. And this first one is the picture that used to be a face. And so it means oneself, or of itself. And the second character, I don't know what this was originally, it's become now a very abstract figure. That means so.